Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Transmedia Art Seminar. My name is Magda Romanska, and I am the chair of the seminar. We want to thank Mahindra Humanities Center and MetaLab at Harvard for co-sponsoring this seminar. Today, we are thrilled to welcome David SALTZ, who's going to be talking about mixing theater and film. David is a well-known and established and is very much esteemed scholar with multiple books to his name, and on the topic of transmedia, on the topic of media and theater, and on the topic of film and theater. So we are thrilled today to have him and to be able to present his lecture and his recent research. Thank you so much, David. We're happy to welcome you.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm going to disappear now, and David will share his screen.
All right. Everybody theoretically should see my screen now.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, wonderful. All right. So today I will be talking about mixing theater and film and why that is more challenging and more transformative than it might initially appear. So the premise here is that film and theater have an enormous amount in common, and the relationship between film and theater has been very fraught, actually, and interesting since the advent of film at the end of the 19th century, with initially a lot of film artists being very concerned about being seen as nothing other than recorded theater, and working very hard to establish the distinction between film as an art form from theater, and decrying over theatrical cinematic conventions. And on the flip side, with many theater artists being very concerned about film superseding theater as an art form, and emphasizing, again, the distinction and the magic of live theater. But incontestably, there is a profound similarity. Many films initially were adapted from plays. That still happens. Increasingly, more and more plays are being made from films. Many actors go back and forth between live theater and cinema. Many directors go back and forth. So among creative practitioners, the distinction is often much less profound than one might think from a lot of the theory, particularly, again, in the early 20th century, as both forms were competing with each other and also establishing themselves within modernist paradigms of sort of essentialist media and art forms. But the fundamental similarity, the reason that theater and film are, I think, indubitably close kin, is that they are both dramatic, which means, going right back to the Aristotelian definition, they're forms in which live actors, typically human beings, actually embody fictional characters to act out, for narrative theater and narrative cinema, to act out stories, which is profoundly different from, say, written narratives, either oral or novels, certainly different from paintings, from sculptures. It's a very distinctive way of telling a story. So what are the differences? They've been, of course, enumerated significantly. So just to go over the familiar ones, of course, there is first and foremost and most obviously the basic ontological distinction between theater and film, the definitive one, the one that actually defines them as two different media, and that is that theater is live. You're actually in the presence of flesh and blood human beings in the same space who are acting out the story, and film is a photographic media in which you do not have the live presence of the performers, but there were live performers in the past who were recorded, and their performances were then transformed into cinema. So that's pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. The huge question has been how significant that difference is, and of course that's been debated in very lively ways recently. with some people arguing and having argued from the beginning that that's a really, really profound difference. And on either side, that might give a benefit to either art form. Others, particularly since Phil Ostlander's, of course, famous book, first edition Liveness, which is now in its third edition, arguing that the difference is less meaningful than people might suppose. But in any case, there's clearly an ontological difference and a phenomenological difference that comes along with that. Again, people have written extensively about that and describe it differently, but many people who romanticize live performance will talk about the phenomenology, that experience of being in a room, breathing the same air as these performers, watching them as they are dying in front of you, as Herb Lau famously said, etc. And of course, but a lot of work in the phenomenology of film dealing with the screen image and that phenomenology of being alone with the image, even when there are others with you in the darkness, being completely subsumed. Beyond that, there are certain straightforward formal differences, which are much easier to describe and less controversial. Obviously, in live theater, the audience is sitting in whatever location they're sitting in, or standing or walking, and different audience members will see the same event from different perspectives. So you've got a fixed vantage point, whereas in cinema, the live performers, the actors, are recorded from cameras that can move, do intense close-ups, can change positions. So the audience is all watching the performance from the same perspective, but that perspective is constantly changing. So that obviously opens up huge differences in terms of the way the narrative can be told. Same thing, uniform perspective versus variable and volitional perspective. And then linear time versus editing, of course, is very significant. So in a theater event, you're going to be watching an event as it unfolds in real time. So even if the narrative jumps around, even if you have flashbacks within the live performance, you are watching that performance happen in real time. Whereas in film, of course, shots can be edited completely out of sequence. They can be, there are many examples of films that were shot over many, many years. So there is no single event, we'll get back to this, that necessarily is being recorded in a film. All right. So there are all of those differences, but then again, beyond, any of those is that reality of the idea that a human being is still embodying a fictional character and you're reading their performance. So I'd like to emphasize here yet another difference that has been very much underappreciated, in fact, basically ignored altogether, which in my mind is perhaps the most significant difference of all. And that is the difference in the way that audiences actually read the dramatic performance. So in both cases, again, the performances are dramatically enacted in front of you, and you're seeing an actor performing certain actions that you then interpret as telling you something about a fictional character's actions, right? So for the most part, that aspect of theater and film has been seen as equivalent. So the way the images are put together is different, the vantage point is different, but that basic idea that you're watching a human being act out another human being's story, the way that you perceive that is presumed in virtually all literature discussing the difference and similarities between theater and film as being analogous. Of course, many people don't address that question at all, but one who relatively recently did, Bruce McConaughey, in his work in audience perception and cognitive theory, has argued this very explicitly. He says, I quote, "Most of the mental operations that Homo sapiens deploy to make sense of live performance are also used to understand filmic ones. While there are important historical differences among live and mediated modes of communication, they share a common evolutionary and cognitive foundation." So again, the idea is that the way that we make sense of the idea that you've got a human being in front of you acting out a story about another human being, It doesn't matter whether you're watching it in film or in theater. You've learned those same techniques, and those techniques carry over from one to the other. All right. So that's what I want to argue is actually there is, in fact, a very, very profound and fundamental difference between the conventions of theater and of film. All right. So within film theory, philosophers and theorists have described that difference between the way that you encounter a human being primarily as one of degree. For example, the philosopher Kendall Walton, who's one of the most influential philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition, and his book, Mimesis' Make-Believe, really has become foundational among philosophical aesthetics in the United States and in England. He has argued that the main distinction between theater and film from the reception point of view is that theater creates a more vivid experience because the actors, who he describes as our objects of imagining or props of make-believe, are actually present. So we project onto these actors this fictional reality, and they're really there. Whereas in film, we're in the presence of nothing but images on a screen. Okay. Conversely, many film theorists, Andre Bazin, Stanley Cavell, Roland Barthes, have argued exactly the opposite. In both of their, in all of their cases, they argue that film allows for a vividness and an intimacy that's really, really profound and completely immersive. That theater, where you're sitting at a distance and watching these actors on a stage far away from you, they can't create that degree of vividness and intimacy. Okay, but in either case, I'm not going to adjudicate between those different positions. In either case, the difference they're describing is just a difference of degree and not of kind. And it doesn't fundamentally alter the relationship, that fundamental relationship between the real-time performance by actors and the fictional event that performance betrays. All right, so what then am I arguing is this important difference? All right, actually, this last little thing. According to this line of reasoning, theater is a live event in which live actors enact a fictional narrative, while film is a visual recording of such an event. So in both cases, you got the same basic dynamic of a human being acting out somebody else's story. Okay, so what's the problem with this? What's the limitation of this view? Film, as film theorists and directors have been arguing from the beginning, is not simply recorded theater. Right? Film does not always, in fact, film almost never records a continuous pro-filmic event in which actors are enacting a narrative in real time. There are, of course, great exceptions to that, like Hitchcock's The Rope, but the fact that those are great exceptions, that was all done in just 2 long tracking shots, spliced together to seem like they're one. The fact that that's such a big deal highlights that, in fact, the film conventions typically do not allow for a single performance event at all, okay? And that continuity editing creates the illusion of the performance of a narrative event. You perceive it as if it were continuous. So if you've got even as simple a shot as somebody going into their car, driving to the store, buying a box of Cheerios and driving home, you could record that over many days, potentially with multiple actors. There'd be the shot of the person opening the door, leaving their door, maybe a close-up of them with the keys in the car, getting into the car, driving off. Those shots might be recorded in completely different orders. You might have a hand actor for the key if the regular actor is unavailable or too expensive to do that shot. But the audience, as they're watching it, will watch those shots edited together as if they were a continuous experience. Whereas in theater, if you see somebody enacting that same narrative, that you are actually seeing an actor performing that event. Okay, so film is not simply the recording of a theatrical performance. It's a recording of many, many different theatrical performances, potentially edited together to create the illusion of a single performance. Okay, the basic process here is strictly analogous to multi-track studio recordings, particularly the way, as some theorists of rock music have argued, it happens in rock, really beginning in the 1960s with musicians like the Beatles, when they left doing their live performances and went into the studio and created albums like Sgt. Pepper's, where they created these songs sometimes over a month or more with multiple tracks that did not represent any single performance of the song, but were layerings of many, many different elements. And many times, all four Beatles weren't even necessarily in the studio at the same time as they layered certain things, created certain instruments. But at least according to many rock theorists, the audience listens to that, aware consciously that there was no single performance as being recorded, but they, just as in a film, listen to it as if it is this sort of virtual performance that never actually happened. Okay. All right. So what I want to argue is that film and theater ultimately engage radically different representational strategies, and that film is a pictorial medium, while theater is a ludic medium. And these are, again, I'm going to argue, quite different ways of representing the world with pretty deep implications. But one point that I want to underline initially, and I'll be highlighting this later, is when I say film is a pictorial medium and theater is a ludic medium, a question that we have to ask is, assuming that I convince you and you buy this, is that inherent? Is that fact an inherent quality of film and theater? Is it baked into the ontology in some way? Or is it contingent, historically contingent? And just, I'll put it out there right now to end the suspense. I'm going to be arguing that it is historically contingent. There's nothing essentialist or ontologically necessary about that connection, but it is a very, very, very deep connection, both in contemporary Western society and actually throughout history, in the case of theater, and in many different cultures. And we can explore later. I'm not going to explore today why that might be the case. But again, it's not an essential. I'm not making an essentialist argument. All right. So what do I mean by ludic versus pictorial? What is the difference? Okay. So as you might imagine from the name, most representational paintings are pictorial. So if you've got a painting of, King George, right? Then you don't have a real, you've got an image, a picture that you are reading as representing King George, and that films fundamentally operate in very much the same way. And this is an argument that's been made by many philosophers who discuss film. In particular, Timothy Curry has argued, or Gregory Curry, I'm sorry, that name is wrong on the slide. Gregory Curry has argued that film engages with what he calls perceptual imagining. In other words, when we look at a picture, a painting, or we watch a film, typically the way that we engage with that is we imagine that we are looking at what is being represented. And so all the same strategies that we would engage in order to say, look at a human being, we engage when we look at a painting of King George, or if we look at a filmic representation of King George. And they are, as the philosopher Nelson Goodman wrote famously in Languages of Art in the 1960s, they are visually replete. And that means that within conventional paintings, and again, there are many exceptions to this in particular, but within conventional paintings, every detail of the image is aesthetically significant. Unlike, say, writing, which is the key distinction that he's making, linguistic forms, where you've got discrete letters that then form these discrete syntactic units. In a painting, as in music, every detail is open to interpretation. Again, we'll get into this distinction in a moment. By contrast, in theater, what I'll be arguing is the rules of the game define real actions that the actors perform in front of an audience, and real objects that actually exist in front of the audience that count as an imaginary action or object. And I'll get into the implications of that. So ludic, of course, that term refers to play, to games. Basically, my argument is that theater is a game of make-believe, representational narrative theater, whereas narrative cinema is literally, as it's been aptly called, a moving picture. All right. So, for example, you get the very clear distinction that people make intuitively between a film and a recorded theatrical event, which gives a lot of weight, I think, to this argument that filmmakers have made, that film as an art form is not simply recorded theater, because there is such a thing as recorded theater, right? And there is a meaningful distinction. So let's take, for example, Frankenstein. There have been many filmic versions of Frankenstein. Of course, the Boris Karloff version is the most famous one. So here we've got the story of Frankenstein, adapted, of course, from Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. That story is told filmically, right? So that's a first order representation. We've got this image that we look at, and we see the image as a representation of Frankenstein, in this case with the little girl he's about to throw into the water. All right, as opposed to recorded theater, which we have below, that famous National Theater production of Frankenstein. When we look at that, we see two actors on a stage at the National Theater in London acting out a theatrical representation of Frankenstein. So that's a second order representation. When you're looking at the play, you're seeing these actors telling the story of Frankenstein theatrically in the theater, and then that representation is filmed, and then we're watching the film of this theatrical representation of the play. Okay. To look at another example, you have, of course, there is a wonderful recording of the original Broadway production of Sweeney Todd, which you see below. And so when you watch that film, you're watching a film of a theatrical production. It's a recording of a theatrical production, and it is absolutely wonderful. And then, I believe, much less successful, but there was, of course, Tim Burton's cinematic telling of the story, Sweeney Todd. So if you look at the distinction between these two images, as you're looking at Sweeney Todd in the top, that film, that image, you're looking into this fictional realm, you're looking into the world of Sweeney Todd. My argument is that when we watch the film below, we are looking at the stage on Broadway in 1980, and then that event is telling us the story of Sweeney Todd. And one experience is not better or more valid than the other, but they are telling their stories, I think, in quite different ways. All right, so let's dive a little bit more deeply into the way that pictorial representation works and Curry's concept of perceptual imagining. So what Curry says, and again, this is in his book, Image and Mind, Film Philosophy and Cognitive Science from the 1990s, which has become really foundational among philosophers of art dealing with film. He argues that when we see the screen, we imagine that the character's eyes are exactly that shape, that color, and that size in relation to the rest of the character's features. If what we saw on the screen were shaped or colored in a slightly different way, then what we would have imagined about the character's features would have been correspondingly different, right? So every detail of that image translates into the representation of the fiction. All right. And the idea that something is replete, syntactically complete, is very similar to that. Nelson Goodman argues differences in every element and every detail within the frame of the image affect what is represented. So let's look at these two filmic representations then. So in the image of Frankenstein, from this image, we can infer that Frankenstein, in the world being represented, has a flat head. He is kneeling in front of a lake. There is a little girl next to him. If he's in front of a little fern plant, we could count the number of leaves on that fern plant, and those are the number of leaves in front of him. If a rabbit were to scurry in front of him, then in that fictional world, a rabbit would have scurried in front of him, and so forth. All right. And in the image below as well, there's a window behind Sweeney. There are people outside that window looking in. Every detail in that image transfers into the fictional world. That is very much not the case in ludic theater, as we'll be seeing in a moment. And I do want to emphasize, though, that this idea of pictorial representation should not be conflated in any way, shape, or form with realism, as it sometimes can be. Something can be pictorially represented that is completely not realistic, and something can be ludically represented, which is profoundly realistic. And in fact, there have been arguments that realism is most effective if presented ludically, which would be a way of translating, actually, I would argue, some of Brecht's ideas. So they are quite distinct. Of course, the concept of realism is profoundly ambiguous in any case. In here, we've got a couple of examples of films that represent completely unrealistic worlds in a completely pictorial way. So, of course, above, we've got the original film of Ghostbusters at the end. Again, we can read every detail from that image represents what happened in this fictional world, which is deliberately not a realistic world. And there's no suggestion that it's our world or could ever happen. In the bottom left, we've got Honey, I Shrunk the Kids with the giant, Cheerio. And then on the right, we've got Spider-Man. Superhero movies tend to be often very much not realistic and profoundly pictorial. All right. Theater, by contrast. Theater, as I'm arguing, fundamentally, within its primary conventions, are games of make-believes. They said real actions within a fictional context. So we see below there's an image of whose line is it anyway, which I think perfectly exemplifies that idea. So within theater, the fundamental starting point is not to create a moving picture of the world you're representing, which can be read through an act of perceptual imagining and is syntactically replete. By contrast, you've got human beings, typically, who are, strictly speaking, players of games, right? So I've argued consistently for many years now that the term play that we use in theater is absolutely apt. And the word for actors is completely apt, but as is the word players. Actors are players of games that adopt a set of objectives that govern real behavior in real time in front of an audience. So the experience of going to a play is, in that sense, directly analogous to the experience of going to a sporting event, where you also have performers performing different roles according to the rules of the game. The difference is the rules of the game are, of course, going to be quite different, as they are with different sporting events. And that games in theater tend to be based around narrative, and those are the ones that we're focusing on now. Whereas sporting events are more loosely, sometimes somewhat loosely related, connected to narrative. So they don't tell stories in quite the same way. Players, both in the game of chess, the game of basketball, and the game of Hamlet, don't need to have any personal inherent motivation. They take on the motivations when they commit themselves to performing within that particular game. Their goals are defined by the rules of the game. So each play and each genre of theater and each world of conventions of theater, in a layered way, define the rules of a game and define different roles for the players. And in agreeing to play the game, you step into those roles. And as in any play, you abandon those goals when the game ends. Again, because film is not a discrete event in that way. When you watch a film, it's a very different experience than going to a theater event and watching these players for the duration of the performance event play the game of whatever it is you might be watching. Improvised theater is a game in precisely this sense, right? Scripted theater gets trickier, and I've discussed this in a lot more depth in other essays, so I'm not going to delve into that now. But I have argued that scripted theater can function in very much this same way, insofar as the performers adopt game conventions, again, as I've defined them, which basically involves committing themselves to performing in their role in real time in front of the audience. And in theater, as in all games of make-believe, and this is absolutely key, the rules of the game, first of all, do not need in any way to be predicated in rules of daily behavior at all, right? And they can redefine actions as we may understand them in our day-to-day experience, actions such as eating food or killing somebody or copulating or whatever that might be. Any action or object can be defined as counting as any other imaginary action or object. So in a particular convention, I can easily say, when I clap my hands like this, then that in this world signifies, say, shooting somebody. And the rule is, if I look at you and do this, you have to fall down, right? Or you can define rules that have no particular real world analogy. When I do this, you freeze. Exactly the same thing. You adopt those conventions, and then we've got a story that we are not just telling, but enacting, that involves this world in which I clap my hands and you freeze. Okay? By ludically redefining potentially dangerous actions and objects, games of make-believe can create safe environments to play, interact, and learn within. Hence, we get Boalian performance, theater for social change, dramatic play therapy, etc. All right. So a key concept that I have developed that grows out of this basic notion of theater as ludic, as a game, is that in dramatic performance, and in particular in live theater, but also in some other recorded mediums, the fiction isn't simply something that the story tells us. It's not a semiotic process. It's not a matter of communication. The fiction actually provides an imaginative framework that governs real world actions in playing the game. Again, exactly the same way that a game of chess is a real action with, real things happening, and people, you can criticize not just the way they played in terms of their success, but their courtesy, their humor, all of those different elements. We enjoy watching people play these games, whether they're playing the game of Antigone or playing the game of football. Okay. So the key point is that if we do not, when we're done watching a game of make-believe in theater, then typically the audience can say, this is the story that was told. So there is ultimately a fiction that comes out of it, the out fiction. But I've argued that in interpreting the significance of the theater event, people have obsessed on this, what I'm calling the out fiction, or the commutative function, and that in many cases, that's simply not what is most interesting or even at all interesting to an audience. And what I want to emphasize instead is the importance of understanding the way that the fiction, as I said, provides this imaginative framework for real action. So rather than the actors exist to tell us a story, the story exists to create a game that is either fun or meaningful or life-changing to watch for the actors. So that's what we have, for example, in improv games. The fun is watching these actors take on these fictional roles and seeing what they do with it, how they respond to it, etc. The fun of watching a production of Hamlet, which you may have seen the play hundreds of times before, is not to find out what happens in Hamlet, but to see these particular players and directors and designers playing this game in a distinctive way. So it's the here and now actions of the performers that are significant. And again, that's not simply a recreational ludic activity. That can be a profoundly moving or educational one, again, as I alluded to already with theater of the oppressed or play therapy, what you actually gain in rehearsing or simulating actions that then ultimately you might learn from and then apply to the real world. So it's not about the story that you're told, but the experience that you have. And the same dynamic occurs in all kinds of role-playing games. So theater is precisely like children's play in video games and many other role-playing games in this way. And I would argue different from pictorial media in this way. So then to get into history of theater, many of us are very familiar with Thornton Wilder back in 1931. His happy journey from Trenton to Camden came about at a point when, as we'll be discussing in a moment, pictorial conventions had really begun to dominate the theatrical event. So he very self-consciously wanted to get back to these ludic roots of theater. And so in this particular play, he adopted a convention which has now become quite common and second nature. And that is the bare stage, 4 chairs, and those chairs represented a car. And once you understood those rules of the game, nothing else was necessary other than knowing these 4 actors are sitting in these chairs and it is a car. And again, this is very, very standard for improvisation and for many, many forms of theater. And by the 1960s, had become incredibly prevalent, this ludic form. So significantly, in looking at these 4 actors enacting this story of a family driving to Camden, it is not visually replete, and we are not engaged in perceptual imagining. We don't say, okay, I'm going to look at this as if it were a car, in which case you would say, okay, if I was looking at this as if it were a car, it's a car without any walls, and it's a car where these seats are made out of metal. They seem to be able to fold in a really, really weird way. And it's a car with an invisible steering wheel. Obviously, nobody interprets it that way. You go along with the rules of the game, you understand the premise that the actors are playing with, and then you see what they do with it. Okay, completely different mode, I would argue, of perception and of making sense of what you're seeing. But if you did not understand, this is the in fiction, if you walked in late and you didn't understand what was going on and you didn't speak the language, then you would have no way of looking at that image and saying, okay, I understand it's a family driving to maybe the steering wheel will give you a little bit of a hint. But the narrative helps you understand the real life performance event, the action that the actors are playing, as opposed to the actors conveying the narrative. Actually, it's not, it's in addition to. And of course, this convention, as Wilder himself pointed out, is in fact the dominant convention in Western theater history. It was pictorial realism that was the aberrant. So Shakespeare's Globe, of course, is ludic in precisely this way. It is not creating a replete picture of the fictional events. Greek theater, very, very similar. Medieval theater, virtually every form of theater for most of Western theater history. And of course, then if you look at non-Western forms like No, Kabuki, Chinese opera, Kudiyattam, pictorial representation is very much the exception rather than the rule. Again, with most of modernism following Thornton Wilder, many of the greatest works and those that were perceived of as being modern, like Peter Brook's great Midsummer Night's Dream, were highly, highly ludic in nature. Again, you are not engaged in pictorial imagining. I think the image on the right of Bottom with a clown's nose instead of a donkey's head, within the rules of the game, when he's donning a clown's nose, everybody sees him as a donkey. And we understand that convention. It's a fun convention. It's a clear convention. It makes total sense. And of course, recently, Hamilton, when we're watching this rap battle between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, we don't actually say, oh, this is a story about this magic world where Thomas Jefferson was holding a mic and they were rapping with each other. And of course, the cross-racial casting. It's not like Bridgerton. It's not an imaginary world in which the founding fathers were in fact diverse. This is an event in which the story of Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton debating is told as a game of the rap battle. And the very fact, what we're looking at, what makes the experience valuable isn't, oh, I'm learning the story about Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton, but watching these specific actors with their specific histories and their specific significance and their specific talents engaging in this event. All right. So briefly, you run into issues then with adaptation, where you have a ludic theatrical event like the John Dexter's famous production of Equus in 1973 at the National, where the horses were performed in these highly abstracted costumes in this wonderfully physicalized way on a stage that was very much a ludic space of almost like a boxing ring kind of space with audience members all around it. And then when that film, when the play was turned into a film with exactly the same cast doing the same performances, it was a critical flop, I think an artistic flop. What made that ritualistic play worth watching, that performance event, was completely lost when we create this pictorial representation, this, again, completely replete pictorial representation with the same actors of the same story. A much more successful adaptation, but that also shows the same process, was Chicago, which is a profoundly ludic play, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner in the wonderful scene with the performer being a ventriloquist dummy on the lawyer's lap. There is no attempt to create a replete pictorial image of the fictional scene. We understand the rules of the game. We understand the metaphor of the vaudeville sort of performance, and we watch as they enact that. And then in the film, in this particular case, again, embracing the pictorial conventions of cinema, the approach was to create these realistic scenes as a frame, and then the subjective images still pictorially replete of this imaginary vaudevillian performance. So you can see the vaudevillian performance with the ventriloquist dummy is presented in a pictorially replete way that engages our perceptual imagining, as opposed to, even though it's non-realistic and purely subjective, as opposed to the theatrical version. All right, exceptions that prove the rule. As I said, my argument is not that these are ontologically baked in, this distinction, but they are conventional. And we do have, of course, a significant history in theater that begins in the Renaissance and really is culminated at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century of scenic realism, which is, again, an aberration in the history of theatrical performance. In theater history, the most frequently cited culmination of this trend was, of course, David Belasco's famous production of The Governor's Lady, which you've got this image of that picture that could easily be a shot from a film. As he recreated Child's restaurant, actually purchasing the real supplies that were purchased for the real Child's restaurant down the street and recreating that real restaurant on a stage. And that convention of the box set does continue to this very day, that 19th century convention. This is a production we did at the University of Georgia a few years ago. Again, that picture that could practically be a film set. The goal is to make it pictorially replete. K2, designed by Ming-Cho Lee, who of course designed many ludic productions, is recreating in the style of 19th century melodrama, which strives to create these outside environments, this image. And then ludic cinema, one of the most famous examples was Dogville, Lars von Trier's production with Nicole Kidman, which adopts profoundly theatrical and ludic conventions purely as a film. Was never a play, couldn't really be a play this way. Was panned by critics, most critics, who others thought it was like a really intriguing and interesting experiment, complete failure among audience members who simply didn't know how to perceive it. And I think underappreciated, the 1973 film version of Jesus Christ Superstar is profoundly ludic. It is purely cinematic. It is engaging, taking advantage of what cameras can do, camera angles. It's non-linear, but it is telling this story of the Passion of Christ in a completely playful, ludic way within the ruins of contemporary Jerusalem. And again, much more successful or well-known than Dogville, but when I've shown this to students, they're often quite puzzled. It's like, what's going on here? Where are they? All right. So in the punchline, the main point of this talk then is, what are the implications then of this difference, which I hope I persuaded you of, between ludic theater and pictorial cinema when you create transmedial events that combine live performers with media, which is something that I have been, as both a theorist and an artist, been very interested in for over 30 years now. All right, I want to argue that there are, in fact, two distinct common possibilities. One is that when you incorporate the two, the live performers into a cinematic image, you are creating a pictorial event, right? That the pictorial element, the cinematic mode, dominates. And I refer to that as expanded cinema. And the other is that the theatrical ludic conventions dominate. And so the media elements become part of ludic elements within this playscape of the theater event. And a couple of a couple of examples of both. Expanded cinema, that term is, I borrow it from Gene Youngblood's very significant 1970 book, Expanded Cinema, Foundational Contribution to the Field of Video Art. Examples from both highly commercial and more experimental theater. Peter Pan 360, William Dudley's design, the live performance of Peter Pan in a huge 360 projected space. And here we've got a scene of the children flying to Neverland, and they're flying on ropes, and the landscape is moving behind them, and we create this illusion that they are just flying across the world into this magical space. So as we watch that, it is very much like the magic of watching a film happening in front of us. The media images and the live images are combined into one pictorial image, which we read pictorially like a film with real live elements, which is a lot of fun. Again, from a less commercial standpoint, George Coates' performance works. Of course, George Coates in the 80s and early 90s was one of the pioneers in incorporating digital media with live performance, and tended to create these often surrealistic, fanciful, spectacular images that combine the live elements with the media elements and subsume them in this wonderful pictorial environment. And more recently, one of my favorite contemporary groups, 1927, which creates these spectacular, fun, amazing combinations. If you haven't seen them, I encourage it strongly, with the live performers who are bedecked in sort of an expressionistic aesthetic, combined with these wonderful expressionistic animations to create this wonderful pictorial effect. So notice in all of these examples, the media was functioning as scenery, with the actors and characters being live, and sometimes some characters also being in the media. But as I've argued elsewhere, media can fulfill many, many different functions in theater. And I'm not going to go through all this now since I've elaborated this elsewhere. But in addition to functioning as scenery, of course, media can function as an actor within a live theater event, as a prop, as a costume, as an inner world, as a mirror. In other words, if you have a real-time video projected behind a live performer, then you see a replication, a double, an amplification of the actor's performance. and as an audience reacting to and commenting on the live performance. And most typically, when media functions as scenery, it takes control of the spatial dimension of the entire performance event and will typically establish the overall work as being pictorial. Again, you can also, within that, in addition, have virtual props and virtual costumes and virtual everything else. But my argument is that the fundamental, in order for media to function as expanded cinema, first and foremost, the media needs to take over the environment, the scene. Okay, and then I also just, as an aside, I want to remind you that it's not necessary for media to create the scene in order to have pictorial theater, as we've seen with scenic realism. The second option is augmented theater, where the ludic takes a dominant role. So, for example, the recent hit production of Curious and Sinister Dog in the Nighttime on the West End and then transferred to Broadway, brilliant example of a highly ludic performance in which you have these media elements that are very fundamental to the theater event, but help to contribute to the ludic nature of the event. The Wooster Group is there For You the Birdie and many, many, many others of their works, but here you've got a hybrid character created from a video and the live actor, creating what I argue is a type of virtual costume. The media and the live performer become one entity together in a highly ludic, playful way. In interactive performance work, this is an example mezza de voce from about 13 years ago, very typical of this kind of work, where you had a live performer who makes sounds, and those sounds are algorithmically turned into these abstract shapes that float up, these bubbles that get larger and smaller and move in different ways depending on his volume and his pitch, is very, very playful and very, very ludic. And then projection mappings, holographic projection. We've got the installation artist Tony Usler, and then in a very mainstream way, the highly controversial performance where Snoop Dogg performed with the hologram of the then deceased Tupac Shakur. Again, the mediatized performer is brought into the space of the ludic space of the concert. An example from my own production last year, an original adaptation of Alcestis, where we used iPad masks that were animated in real time to express what the actors were doing. So these, very, very much a ludic performance. And another example from my own work, I've done robotic theater in which a robot performs commedia characters with a live performer. And again, the robot is very much a work of media, though in this case, not cinematic, within a ludic event. And then finally, last but not least, so you've got these two extremes of the expanded cinema and the augmented theater, one where the pictorial dominates, the other where the ludic dominates. And then there are some fascinating works where you get the equivalent of the rabbit duck perceptual illusion, which is why I have a rabbit duck on the screen from Wittgenstein, where deliberately these productions play with the ambiguity between these two different modes and exploit the ability to flip back and forth in foreground, pictorial, or ludic modes. One example is the 39 Steps, which, as you may know, very popular comic farce with 4 actors who recreate the film 49 Steps with very theatrical means. I'm going to show you a very, very short video example from that.
Probably one of my favorite parts of the show, we call it the shadow play. It's really like a puppet show. We're all in charge of different things. Robert is running as usual. For me, it kind of sums up this show. I look around, I see all the stagehands, all the actors, everyone's on deck for that. And everyone has this kind of childlike glee about it. And it's theater at its simplest, but at its most effective and its most imaginative.
But it's also the most cinematic moment
Yeah.
in the play, all through the magic of puppets. It's really, really quite cool. But there's a great joy that the audience can't see.
All right. And so I agree wholeheartedly with what that actor was saying, that moment was simultaneously profoundly theatrical, and I would say, to be more precise, profoundly ludic. And I think in many cases where people say theatrical, that's precisely what they mean, and profoundly cinematic. And the delight you get in watching it, and he said in performing it, is to see these actors playfully recreating this cinematic effect. So you can flip back and forth between the how, the game that they're playing, and then the illusion of the planes getting larger and smaller, et cetera, in a cinematic kind of way. Similarly, Village Association Jet Lag, similarly, but also very different strategy, where we see on stage the performer in front of the background in a way that's clearly, a live performer in front of a background, and then that is shot like a film, and then we see the video image of that. So you can literally go back and forth between watching it as a real-time film and watching it as a performance. And then finally, and probably most famously, again, another Wooster Group example, the Wooster Group's incredibly, influential and highly studied and highly analyzed production of Hamlet. Interesting for many reasons, but of course, in that production, they took a film and then performed in front of it, in many cases, playfully trying to reenact the skips, the jumps, which they actually inserted into the film. They made the film rougher than it actually was, highlighting the artifice of this game that they were playing, enacting with the cinema. I'm going to show you a very short excerpt of that as well, where you see them removing actors from the film and highlighting the fact that they've done that with these rectangles and having the actors work in front of it in a way that challenges us to create that sort of single immersive image in a way that is completely impossible, and in fact we know is not really what their game is about at all.
I embrace it for you. And will this brother's wager frankly play? Give us the foils, come on, cut one for me. I'll be your foil layer, teasing my ignorance. Your skill shine like a star in the darkest night. Stick fiery off indeed. You mock me, sir? No. But give him the foils, young Osric, cousin Hamlet. You know the wager? Very well, my lord. Your great... Do not drink.
I will, my lord. I pray you pardon me.
So in some cases, as you saw, they move the actor. In other cases, they double the original performer. Okay. All right. So in conclusion, I've argued that there are two fundamentally different ways of perceiving and engaging in dramatic performances, ludic and pictorial. I've argued that theater today, and especially historically, both in the West and in many other cultures, is a ludic medium, while film, since its inception in the late 19th century, is typically pictorial. And this difference has profound implications for narrative works that combine live performance and filmic media, presenting a lot of challenges, but also a lot of amazing artistic, creative opportunities. And this is the one step beyond what I have time to talk about today. I'd argue that this juxtaposition of the ludic and the pictorial has equally profound implications for other narrative media, such as social media, like YouTube, telematic performances, for example, the Zoom theater events that people experimented with during COVID, which I would argue were properly thought of as Zoom theater as opposed to cinema, and video games. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. This was wonderful, very lucid elaboration of the difference, and particularly what happens when those two theater and film are put together, because the tradition, the history behind them such different ways of making both artworks. Yeah. So so this was a very great lecture that really illuminated those differences in a very clear and comprehensive fashion. So we really very much appreciate it. I have a kind of a question that I wanted to ask you. You mentioned this distinction between the ludic and pictorial can help us in the analysis of theater, which includes film. And it can also potentially help us illuminate or analyze works such as Zoom theater or video games. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Like, can you tell me, or can you tell us what, like, in which way something like Zoom theater is both pictorial and ludic at the same time? And the second question that I have is, with the transmedia storytelling, which can involve both online component and live component, and both can be cinematic or theatrical. How does it complicate? Is there? I'm wondering if there is a kind of a third term for that sort of transmedia reality, and what would this term be? Because those two terms, as very useful as they are in the analysis of theater and film separately and together, if we include this third dimension of multi-platform movement, then something else also happens. And we've been kind of struggling in this seminar series with other speakers, trying to figure out what is that third thing that happens during those sort of transmedial engagements. Is this something that you've been thinking about? Can you elaborate? Can you kind of brainstorm a little bit with me on this?
Sure, absolutely. So to start with the question about the Zoom performance, so the majority of Zoom performances, of course, were different people in different squares in their different locations, often doing stage readings or concerts together. Sometimes it was, sometimes they were pre-recorded, but sometimes people were trying to do these live events. Obviously that kind of image is a telematic, we move into their worlds, right, into their performance spaces. But it's profoundly ludic in the way that I described. It's not pictorially replete. It was telling the story, and which is why I think, and then they adopt these conventions. All right, we are going to be a family around the table, and we're all looking straight out, and we're talking to each other. We buy those conventions. We are used to buying conventions from theater, but that particular convention is not one that would ever be used in theater. So it's as ludic as any theatrical event, but embracing its reality in a very natural way. And I think that example actually in some ways touches on, I'll get to other examples, but on your point that I think that this basic idea of ludic and pictorial has a lot of mileage, that once as soon as you combine different elements in different media, then you can play different sorts of games. And it's as I said, it's not it's a continuum, and you can combine them in different ways, but you can actually get a lot analyzing these events as in terms of the rules of the game and the ludic elements, and engaging these two concepts. So it isn't simply saying this is because ludic goes way beyond theater, right? Pictorial goes way beyond theater. I think those are two. So I'm not saying there isn't necessarily a third thing, but typically theater is already, of course, as we all discuss all the time, a multimedia form. It always engages with many forms of theater, including commercial theaters like musicals, are theoretically really bizarre and complex to analyze exactly what's going on. So I think introducing the media introduces those new interesting elements, in particular because of those pictorial conventions. But I don't know that there's any particular reason to think that combining video and live performance is going to create a distinct third thing any more than combining music and performance and instruments, et cetera, in a musical necessarily creates a third thing. I think you can go a pretty long way to saying, what are the rules of the game that you're playing by? How are you combining them? And they're so different. And that's another thing is, in general, I would never want to say that combining, my whole point, in fact, is that you can combine media and live performance in countless ways, that there is no single thing that happens when you bring them together. There are an infinite number of different kinds of ways that you can make them interact with one another, and different sorts of events you can create. So the idea that there is a third thing somehow essentializes the combination in the same way that saying theater has to be ludic. No, I mean, theater was pictorial. There was this period of time when theater was pictorial. Film needs to be pictorial. No, definitely. Video certainly doesn't. I would argue that television in particular has much more of a tradition of ludic conventions than film, for whatever interesting historical reasons. But in terms of the Zoom theater, then, are you familiar with a piece that Bill Irwin did, a 10-minute piece called In Zoom? It was one of the most playful examples, I think, of Zoom theater. It starts with that basic convention of having two people in different spaces talking directly at the camera, but then Irwin does his Irwin-esque kind of shtick using that, where then they begin playing with the idea, should I look at each other? Should we look apart? And they problematize that, and they play with that in different ways. And then he reaches his hand across, and then the hand goes into the other screen, and they start touching each other and engaging with each other. So it creates a very ludic space out of Zoom in a very playful and a very creative way that is rooted very much in the Zoom environment, as opposed to some other pieces that I saw that actually did try to use green screen and actors in different spaces to try to merge them together, which is, again, a fine experiment, but in order to basically create a movie using Zoom in real time. So you had within that the same sort of range of approaches from pictorial to ludic and different ways of defining the rule of the game. But the Zoom, I think, was the center of gravity was toward the ludic, which was interesting because it's a video form, but a video form that led people intuitively to play with the ludic nature of the event.
Yeah, a lot of meta Zoom pieces came out, including operas, which were sort of, singing the stage directions, yeah, for the performances,
yes.
Like you out of Zoom, you muted, unmute yourself, which were incorporated in some of the works that were happening on Zoom at the time.
Definitely.
Where do you think social media fits into this? Like incorporation of Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, whatever social media you're going to be using, or TikTok, as providing a character, a background, or building a character to social media, or even creating an additional scenes or interactions on social media that are part of the performance, that might happen before the actual show or after the show or during the show, or can, continue for many, many months before
Absolutely.
the event happens. How would you classify those sort of engagement? Because, in some ways, they are they are ludic, but because they happen on screen, there is a kind of a mediated quality that also is pictorial, yeah?
Well, strictly, I would actually, because again, that was my point, that video can be totally ludic. It's how you're reading it. But what's interesting about the Twitter kinds of thing, typically it depends on how it's done and whether the Twitter responses, sometimes they are projected behind the performers, sometimes people will vote by Twitter, and then the performers will do something interactive based on the voting, et cetera. But where it's projected behind the performers, there's also the question of whether the performers read it and respond to it and engage with it, or whether it doesn't. So lots of different possibilities even with that. But well, first of all, there are two things. From a function standpoint, because I was talking about the different roles that media can play, from scenic and actor and so forth, where it's projected behind and the audience is commenting on the event. In that case, that's where I was saying, media can function as audience in the same way that you can have, this Piscator style, the commentary on the live performance. And there you have the live audience, maybe even, watching online. Way back actually in 2002, I did a production. It was actually using Shockwave because Twitter wasn't a thing yet, where people were watching a Shockwave stream and then typing things that were projected behind, and then people were interacting with it. And there's been a lot of stuff like that. So very, creating this virtual community, but then bringing the audience's responses as an audience onto the stage. So that can be, in that sense, what's interesting about the writing is that is a third mode. Linguistic representation is neither pictorial nor ludic. It can be used then. So if somebody were to say, do an improv game and say, all right, give me a profession. And then you've got somebody typing in using Twitter saying, all right, we're a doctor, and it's projected on the screen. That's basically doing the same thing as somebody shouting doctor. And then you could have people, on the other side of the world typing doctor, right? And then somebody performs with it. That's clearly ludic. It's engaging in that way, using the words. But the representation, the way that the word doctor, D-O-C-T-O-R, represents doctor is neither ludic nor pictorial. It's linguistic, right? So that's a whole other mode. And certainly when you introduce media into performance, you can, in that case, it would be neither pictorial, inherently pictorial or ludic. But then it could be used, obviously, incorporated in either mode, if then you got a sign that says, welcome to Disneyland, and you see that then as in the fictional world, there was a sign that says welcome to Disneyland. That's pictorial, right? So it all depends on how you use the text.
That's great. I like that sort of, the appearance of the linguistic component that exists in some way outside of those, different things. The big conversation that has been happening during the height of the pandemic was kind of an old conversation as well, is that theater has to happen live. It has to involve a real life co-presence. And I'm taking a little bit of like I kind of question that the whole concept of what real life means, because the internal reality that we often build through mediated mediums can be as real as anything else.
Absolutely.
What you are suggesting is that Zoom theater or transmedia theater, which is mediated theater oftentimes, has that ludic component, which is characteristic to theater. So what you're saying is that the co-presence in the analog world is not a requirement for something to be called theater, but rather the ludic structure or ludic model of the performance. And that's very different than what we've been hearing quite a lot, from the naysayers of the Zoom experiments and other mediated transmedia works. And this approach also changes the very concept of what is real. Yeah, mm-hmm. Adds additional cognitive component and considers the cognitive reality to be on equal terms than analog reality.
Absolutely.
That's a big conceptual shift. And I would argue that this is a shift towards the, film theory. Yeah, because this has been an argument of film theory that
Mhm.
what's happening in our head as we're watching this, as we're watching a movie, is the nature of the film. Like this is what the reality of the film is what we process, how we process the montage, how we process the messaging and how we process the order of events and the order of pictorial images that appear in front of us. And that cognitive reality is the reality of the cinematic
Mhm.
And in theater, we never, it's like this conversation never really crossed over, a little bit with the audience reception theory, but the assumption that a physical bodily presence is primarily a source of real
Yes.
perception has dominated theatrical discourse. With the brief foray, as I mentioned, into the audience reception theory. And what this new transmedia works kind of make us rethink is, and then come back maybe to theater, to traditional theater again, and to consider the cognitive processes that are happening as we watch theater in conjunction with the embodied experience of the body being present in the same building with the group of people, and
Right.
think this kind of a co-presence of the bodily experience, that there is something that happens in between the body reality and mind reality. That
Yeah.
then this is a very specific process, and this mixed forms and the way that you're framing this can help open this new venue of inquiry into the cognition of theater reception, which I think we have not really truly pursued yet in the field.
Mhm. And in terms of the video games, because I think that's really significant, you're discussing that you don't need to have physical co-presence for this sort of live ludic encounter. Multiplayer video games and environments and sandbox spaces to create these very, very real but highly ludic expressions of alternate identities that can become as profound and as meaningful as the identities that you perform in your physical life, and is a really, I think at this point, really exciting site to explore for live performance.
One of the things which we also kind of reached in our seminar series is this notion of what's perceived as real, and how this kind of ludic game-like quality can often translate into political discourse,
Yes.
conspiracy theories, and meaning making in media and across transmedia environments, which of course has huge implications for the delivery of information and for for the politics of the global politics almost. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So understanding the mechanism is extremely important, I think.
Yes.
Anyways, thank you, David. This was fascinating conversation. Thank you for presenting all of this in such a clear and lucid manner. And thank you to all of our participants. And we will post a lecture soon on the Mahindra website, so come and check it out. We want to thank again to David for coming in and presenting this material, and to Mahindra Humanities Center for co-sponsoring the seminar series with MetaLab at Harvard. We invite you to future seminars coming up in the spring. The schedule is posted on both Mahindra website and MetaLab website. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.
I'm going to stop recording.